the member for.
So you said Liberals have gone first.
Oh, yeah. It recognises Nick Elliott, member for Kooyong. So.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And what I can say is it's a real pleasure to be here. And it's finally, we're going to get to the bottom and the truth of the COVID-19 federal response. But before we begin, I just want to remind everyone of the actual topic. Miles, this is also a good point for you to pay attention to. The topic is, has the federal response to COVID-19 been adequate? So the two things I want to bring up and to mention specifically is we're referring to the federal government response, not the state government. The success and failures of individual state governments should not be laid at the feet of the federal government unless it relates to federal government activity. Now, the second point I want to bring up about the topic is adequate. I'm going to interpret this as, was it reasonable to expect our actions? Did our actions bring a positive outcome? We are not looking back and nitpicking with 2020 vision about what would be the ideal scenario. Any government response can be nitpicked and destroyed when you look back with 2020 vision. We are judging it by the actions and the context of its time. So those two key points are very important before we start this debate. And I encourage everyone in the audience, don't judge this debate by narratives in the media or by sensationalist headlines or misquoted phrases from the leadership. Judge it instead by its outcomes. Judge Australia by its outcomes and judge our actions by the context of their time. It's very important that we get that straight from the very beginning. But let's begin. So what can you actually hold the federal government responsible for? What have we done during COVID that made it an adequate and a good and a solid response? In fact, one of the best responses in the developed world. Well, one, let's start with the National Cabinet. This is an unprecedented body, something that has never been put together before, that enabled the cooperation between states and the federal government. This meant that we could have accurate and some of the most advanced modelling and research in the world that would govern the federal response, and not to mention...
point of information.
Yep, go for it.
How can you say we had the best response in the world when Australia is currently 56 in the entire world when it comes to vaccine rollout, behind every single developed country in the world?
That's actually a brilliant point, and I'm surprised you jumped in so early. I was going to jump on that a little bit later, but why not? Let's jump straight into it. Let's look at the vaccine rollout. Let's look at how many vaccines Australia actually has for its population. Australia has always had enough vaccines for those who wanted to get them. The reason why people haven't been getting vaccinated is one reason alone. We are victims of our own success. The Atagi Medical Foundation has said that AstraZeneca was too dangerous for people under 60 to get. Why did they say this? Because the 1 in 100,000 risk of dying from AstraZeneca was greater than the 0% risk of dying from COVID in Australia, because our response was so effective. Now, this has changed. If you look at the UK, they recommended AstraZeneca because the risk of getting the AstraZeneca was nowhere near the risk of getting COVID, because their response was not adequate and it was not effective. So quite frankly, that point just supports the argument that our response was effective and it was good. But let's keep moving. Let's jump back.
Point of information.
Go for it, Neve. Love it.
I think it's interesting that you've mentioned the AstraZeneca there. Why weren't we assessing options in advance of the various number of vaccines that were available to us?
That's another great point, Neve. And I'm glad you brought it up, because there's another point that I want to talk about. Australia, when we're deciding what vaccines we need to buy, we needed to look at, one, what we could produce in Australia, and also the cost and the effectiveness of those vaccines. At the time, AstraZeneca was seen to be the global most effective and the best cost to benefit ratio vaccine that we had. And most importantly, the vaccine could be produced in Australia. Now, a lot of people criticize the Australian government, saying we should have bought Pfizer and we should have developed Pfizer in Australia. But one, I want to remind everyone that we could not and we cannot develop Pfizer in Australia. We cannot produce Pfizer in Australia. And might I remind you that when we actually did buy Pfizer vaccines, the Italians, when they got into a bit of a rough spot, because we couldn't produce them in Australia, they commandeered and they took away our vaccine supply. We needed, as a form of sovereign risk mitigation, to produce a vaccine supply in Australia. And AstraZeneca at that time was the best source of vaccine for that. And like I said, the only reason the vaccine did not go that well is because of the AstraZeneca, the ATAGI changing their health advice. But let's keep going. Let's not get bogged down in points of information, which quite frankly aren't really proving anything. So let's get back to it. So National Cabinet, they produced valuable timelines and risk management. Everyone in Australia is now living their lives on the rollout of the vaccine that is decided by the vaccine, by the National Cabinet. Now, let's jump over to economic support. When COVID hit, it devastated national economies all around the world. And what did Australia do? Did we say, no, too bad, too rough, let's do the neoliberal approach of letting everyone die out and their businesses fail, the governments collapse? No, we came in with JobKeeper. We had some of the most extensive and large economic support in the world. From March to September of 2020, we were supporting businesses and keeping employees linked to their employees. It was not an unmitigated stimulus payment. It was a targeted payment designed to keep employees linked to businesses, which we know has resulted in more people keeping their jobs. Now, we are still offering crisis payments to states who are in lockdown for more than 2 weeks. This payment and stimulus is still supporting states to this day. And might I remind you that some people point to Singapore as the greatest response to COVID in the world. But I just want to remind you that we are just right under Singapore in case numbers. We have just a handful more case numbers than Singapore. Now, if Singapore truly is the best response, has our response really been that bad? And finally, I just want to finish on a little point. When Delta variant arrived, when the Delta variant was notified in India, and we were made aware that the Delta variant was spreading rapidly through India, Australia brought in some of the harshest and strongest restrictions against people coming from India or who had traveled through India and were coming to Australia. At the time, the Australian government was criticised from everyone, from all parties, all throughout Australian politics, because we had over $10,000s of dollars of fines, and we also promised people that if they came back from India, we would give them prison sentences. Now, even though we were criticised at the time, I have no doubt that that reduced and delayed the spread of Delta to Australia and saved hundreds, if not thousands of lives. So, Mr. Speaker, I just want to finish by saying, judge Australia by its outcomes. Judge Australia by spending the majority of the pandemic out of lockdown. Judge Australia by having one of the strongest economies in the world during COVID. Judge Australia by its success. Don't nitpick with 2020 vision because you've got nothing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Miles, you're on mute.
Cool. All right, the floor will now open to questions. Anyone have a question?
Now let's just proceed to the next speaker, Miles.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I feel like. Okay. Well, who goes next? Okay, Freddie, the member for McNamara, will speak next.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want you, fellow Australians, to remember our lives before COVID. We had one of the most prosperous countries in the world. We can all go outside, go to the bar, go to the movies, and do whatever we want. And now look at our country 2 years later. Hundreds of thousands infected, thousands of Australians dead, millions of Australians lost their jobs, tens of thousands of businesses closed, and an entire country is in ruin. And who is that to blame? Scott Morrison. Scott Morrison. Behind bushfires, behind inadequate vaccine rollout, and behind disasters that fell into our country time and time again, Scott Morrison was behind it all. Okay, yeah, I'll take it.
Point of order from the member.
Wouldn't you say that the majority of the time spent in lockdown was a result of states initiating state lockdowns, not as a result of a lack of vaccines? Before the vaccines came to Australia, the majority of time spent in lockdown and the economic impact was a result of a state response, not the federal response.
Oh, let's talk about the states and federation. I mean, the Mr. Morrison said, "Oh, the COVID and vaccines are state responsibility, not the federation, because I don't have to work. I want to go to Hawaii." Well, let me remind you, Mr. Speaker, that there's been 26 leaks in state hotel quarantine and almost 0 leaks in federal quarantine. So if the federation actually did their job and built quarantine centers, Victoria, New South Wales wouldn't be in the mess we are today. So I ask you again, fellow Australians, and I tell you this once more. Behind disasters, behind lockdown, behind the hundreds of thousands of infected, thousands of Australians dead, there lies only one name, and that name is Scott Morrison of the Liberal Party of Australia. Disaster
Point of
after
order on the
disaster. Sorry, Mr.
Member
Speaker.
has a question.
Sorry, Mr. Yep.
Again, I just want to raise the point. You didn't really respond to it earlier. The lockdowns that are felt in each state is a result of individual state actions, not the federal government response.
The member will wait for other speakers to finish their turn before asking questions. The chair recognises Mr. Freddie.
I would like to respond to that, Mr. Speaker. This raises my second point. Of course, the states haven't been perfect. We all seen that in Victoria and in New South Wales. But if we look at countries like Japan, where they reached a very high double vaccination rate, their cases have dropped from the tens of thousands to merely 1,000 or only a few hundred today. And the reason why the states failed so much is because the federation was inadequate in its vaccine rollout. It put all its eggs into AstraZeneca. It said it will put Australia first in the front of the line when it comes to vaccine. Then it chose AstraZeneca, and now most states are terrified of getting a vaccine, and now most states are unvaccinated, and most states are experiencing disaster after disaster. And you know who's behind that disaster? The Federation. Scott Morrison, his health ministers who ignored Pfizer meetings, and now we are left with inadequate vaccine rollout, and that is why we are all suffering. And that is what Labour is going to do different. We are not going to repeat the errors of the Liberal Party. We're going to build the federal quarantine centers. We're going to get more vaccines. We're going to roll them out. And we'll make sure no Australians will be left behind. We'll make sure all Australians will get out of lockdown as soon as possible. And we will make sure that Australia will go back to the glory days of 2019.
Point of order. Point of order.
Okay.
Point of order.
Also,
How do you
Elliot recognised.
How do you reconcile the fact that the majority of lockdowns has been the result of Labor governments, not Liberal governments?
Oh, really?
Mr. Jang is recognised.
Okay, I mean, I'd love to say this. I mean, Scott Morrison said, "Oh, it's all the state Labor's fault." But I remember Mr. Morrison once stated that Gladys Berejiklian, by not locking down New South Wales, was a model for all of Australia. A model, Mr. Speaker. Look at New South Wales. Thousands of infections every single day. The entire state plunged into months and months of lockdown disasters. But that is the model that Mr. Morrison wants us to apply to every Australian state. And I want to say, Mr. Morrison, Victorians do not care about Victoria. He does not give a single crap about Victoria. You know why? His Deputy Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce, once stated that the people of Australia couldn't give a crap about Melbourne, and he could smell the burning ashes of Melburnians from here. And when did Barnaby Joyce, the Deputy Prime Minister, apologize, Mr. Morrison? He didn't apologize, did he? The Federation does not care about Victoria. It only cares about New South Wales. It gave all their vaccines, every single support JobKeeper, to Liberal supporting states. And now Victorians are in a state of disaster, the longest lockdown city in the entire world. And I just want to remind you one last point, Mr. Speaker, about the vaccine rollout. 5 months ago, Australia was 105th in the world when it comes to vaccine rollout, behind Lebanon, behind Bangladesh, a country that barely have electricity.
Gentleman's
Australia was
time is
behind them.
expired. Gentleman's time is
And
expired.
now we are 56.
All right.
It's disaster.
The chair now recognises Miss O'Farrell, the member for Melbourne.
Oh yeah, Miles. Also, Muhammad wants to speak. He has as Labour.
Ah.
So yeah, just after
Labour.
Yeah, after an EM, you see.
Mcdc. My first name is Mcdc.
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
Cool.
Mcdc, yeah.
No problem.
All right, the chair, excellent. The chair now recognizes Miss O'Farrell.
Thank you, Speaker, and good afternoon, fellow politicians. Just what was striking there to me just then, and that's just happened within the realm of a couple of minutes. Within this debate, there were recommendations that we would have 2 points of information per speaker. And of course, the Liberals have misinterpreted again what the rules were, and they've gone for 3 in that previous speech. I think that's very telling of the situation, Speaker, that we find ourselves in today. And it definitely makes sense in tandem with the stats that I will be presenting to you today. But anyways, just for a formal introduction, my name is Neve, and I am speaking on behalf of the Australian Greens political party in response to the debate topic: was the federal response to COVID-19 adequate? Was it appropriate? Was it fair? Not reasonable. I think that's a baseline standard. Was it appropriate, and was it fair? Now, the Australian Greens are a party which prides itself on 4 core values: ecological sustainability, peace and non-violence, grassroots democracy, which is why I'm excited to be here today, and social justice. Social justice. Where is the justice for people in Australia in being lied to by their own Prime Minister, in being fed empty promises by the federal government, being subjected to plenty of photo opportunities of Scott Morrison, as opposed to being able to access a vaccine during this time throughout 2021, and failing to protect our vulnerable populations, our most vulnerable population groups, which have been well established and well documented for decades in this very country. There is no justice, Speaker. There is no justice. I will take a point of information.
Well, you bring up the point about protecting vulnerable Australians. How do you reconcile that against the fact that the AstraZeneca has always been available for the most vulnerable over 60s and elderly Australians in Australia, and has always been there to protect the elderly and the vulnerable people in Australia?
I see. I think that's another Liberal spin. I will go to my stats based on our vulnerable population groups in response to your question. We know that remote Indigenous communities were unfairly treated during this pandemic, and that is for a number of reasons. The Liberal government are already well aware of the basic health facilities that are available to these remote communities, of the staffing problems, of the high chronic disease rates, of the social makeup which doesn't allow for proper isolation, and yet did not even think of listening to any of the Indigenous leaders within this community in order to better protect all Australians, not just the white Sydney-siders who are going on their picnics at the moment, the people that are the makeup of this nation, our very Indigenous groups which have been around for 65,000 years. So I hope that answers your question there. Going back to my previous point, the stats speak for themselves in terms of the inadequacy of this vaccine rollout in particular. Now, while Green senators were advising the federal government in February of 2021, Speaker, February 2021, of the dangers of a slender, inadequate COVID-19 vaccine portfolio, the federal government, once again, did not heed our warning. And by June 2021, with our Prime Minister dismissing our very own needs, Australia was ranked the worst in the OECD in terms of vaccine rollout, and 113th in the world. That was in June 2021. So I think that tells you a very telling tale of the inadequacy in terms of vaccine rollout. Moreover, we know that our Prime Minister has been lying. Oh, continue. Yeah, point of information.
You mentioned that Australia is behind in the OECD in vaccination rates. I just want to ask, do you know where Australia sits in terms of death rates in the OECD?
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. We do sit comparably quite low in terms of deaths. However, they could have been even further reduced. And I will make sure that is just 2 points of information there for you. So thank you very much. In terms of our vaccines, which should have been rolled out at a much early stage, however, our Liberal government were all too familiar and too interested in lobbying for better cash rates, in lobbying for a lower cost, in lobbying for business deals that were unnecessary.
Don't know what woman's time has expired.
Thank you very much for having me, Speaker.
Mr. James, you have a point of information?
Oh, yes. I would like to ask Liam, do you agree with Labour that when it comes to quarantine, it shouldn't be a state matter, but it should be a federal matter.
Ms. O'Farrell has 1 minute.
As we know, in tandem with the federal roadmap, which was explicitly that connection between the federal and the state governments, I believe that it is a failure on the federal government's part in rolling that out to the state governments. We know that because they are the top group, and they're the ones just clapping, and they are the ones rolling it out in a consistent and safe manner to all participating states. So I think that the blame, inherently rests on them.
Thank you, Ms. O'Farrell. Mr. Mohammed is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, hello. So first things first, we're all talking about, like Nick mentioned, the goals of right now, and we shouldn't focus on, the ideal 2020 vision. However, it is important to bring up there are projections, and there are countries that have met their projections, except for ours. According to the Bennett Institution, if we had followed our original vaccine rollout, we would have been at 80% double vax for ages over 16 years old in the middle of August 2021. And guess when the Delta outbreak started? Around the same time. So it's very clear that if we had followed through with our original goal, we might not have a Delta outbreak. Of course, it is inevitable to have a few cases here and there, even with a high vaccinated population, but it would have been a much less tragic situation and a much less much fewer cases. And furthermore, the main reason we weren't able to meet that goal, I feel like the member for Liberal has made it so that our ideal goals of COVID zero have prevented that in a way. However, the problem is with something such as a vaccine, where mandates are coming through for the workforces, people need a choice. People need a choice to be able to choose between whether they want AstraZeneca, whether they want Pfizer, whether they want Moderna. And once those choices became available, however, just in September, where now we have the choice between all three vaccines, we have seen vaccination rates go up day by day. Yesterday was higher than the day before. The day before that was higher than the day before. So even though, yes, this may be because everyone's rushing to get vaccinated because they want to protect themselves during an outbreak. However, whether there is an outbreak or not, I feel like a choice, even for me personally and people from my community of choice, would have definitely been the reason they would have gotten vaccinated. I didn't have much prepared, but I guess that's
I thank the member, Mr. Mohammed. The floor up. We have a point of information from Mr. Elliott, the member for Higgins. No, Kuyong. Go on.
This is more for the floor, but I guess also anyone who can address it. On the point of choice, I would just like to ask, without Googling, if anyone can name any other disease that you get vaccinated against that you would consciously make a choice for one option over the other. Can you name a choice where an individual chooses one vaccine over the other against the wishes of their doctor? Is there an example of individual preference towards vaccines?
Yes, the flu. If you're above 60, you can get another vaccine.
I'm specifically talking about different types of vaccines, not whether you get it or not.
No, there is a different type of vaccine available to people above the age of 65. But I got to go, guys. So,
Okay.
So the floor retires from the position, and it's up to the deputy, hint, whoever that wants to be, to take my position. Thank you very much.
Catch your miles.
Okay,
Thank you. See you, both. See you, guys.
And can I just say, Nick, this is the House of Parliament, not Who Wants to Be a Millionaire.
What?
Okay,
I'm not
but
sure I understand
because okay, don't worry, I'll explain later. Mohammed, would you like to be the Speaker of the House?
that. We don't need a speaker now.
Oh,
do
we
we?
don't need. Okay, all right. Let's just
Yeah,
let's
I'd rather argue points.
Yeah.
let's just have one more round. Oh, do you want to do 2 more rounds, guys? Oh, one more.
I just want to answer Nick's question. On an individual basis, yes, the population may not be as scientifically involved as they are with COVID to care enough to choose between vaccines. However, as medical, medical officers and even GPs can make that choice for really young people for things such as polio and the flu vaccine, where there's different types of combinations of vaccines that they can choose between. Prior to COVID, COVID was one of the first mRNA vaccines, which is distinctly different from the other adenovirus vaccines and stuff. So it makes sense to give people that choice, whether they want to go with this newer technology or this older technology, or they want to outweigh the risks and the benefits.
That's a good point. I think like finding the line is just a little bit difficult for me, because if you argue for more choice, like where does it stop? So say we have 2 vaccines, someone says, I'm not going to get vaccinated unless I get Sinovac. So we have 3 vaccines, we include Sinovac. Someone says, I'm not going to get vaccinated unless I get what they have in Eastern Europe. Like choice, the distinct line between choice. I do understand, I do recognize the premise that more choice can be better. I just think fundamentally it may not apply necessarily to better health outcomes, as long as when you can have other methods to get people vaccinated.
I would just say that I think the root cause of that problem, the whole like brand v brand and stuff that's been, like a common problem that people have had to choose between, was in part due to the federal government and the fact that they would go back on their previous recommendations, which obviously creates more vaccine hesitancy and therefore means that people will want that more choice, rather than your average flu vaccine where the federal government go, here's your standardized flu vaccine, take it, go for it, and people aren't up in arms about, which brand is it? I want, I don't want the flu, I want this one, So I think that was in part of poor mismanagement from the federal level, when they could have been absolutely avoided and our vaccination rates could have been much better.
And just to add to Nia's point, can I ask the Prime Minister, you stated that you believe in choice, and you stated that you want to put Australia in the front of the queue. Then why is that the federal government refused to meet with Pfizer representatives and put all our eggs into AstraZeneca? Doesn't that contradict your point of view that you want to give Australia a choice?
Okay, so fundamentally there was one. I didn't say I believe in choice. That was something that was sort of painted on me by yourself, Mr. Zhang. But fundamentally, there was this shift away from AstraZeneca to Pfizer that occurred as a result in the shift in the ATAGI advice. ATAGI is an independent organisation. It's not something that the federal government can control. And we're quite proud of the fact that we don't control it. It is very independent and it gives advice based on health advice, not political advice. So the argument that we should have met them in person, or that we should have visited them like in a room, to travel overseas during a pandemic and then be stuck for 2 weeks in quarantine when you come back, it's not really going to produce the best outcomes for Australia compared to, realistically, it's a contractual agreement. A lot of perhaps more old-fashioned people think that you need to be there in person and to shake someone's hand to get something done. But I think our lives and our education has proven that you can very effectively make business dealings and even education online through Zoom, through multiple Zoom conferences. I might just want to refer you to AUKUS, one of the biggest defence pacts announced in recent years, was mostly negotiated over online forums. And I think if it's good enough for our world leaders, then it's good enough for our leading corporations.
Yes, where the Liberal Party betrayed France, our biggest trading partner, but yet you talk about contracts and obeying contracts, yes.
Yeah.
But I think on that point, like you go back to that, and I just think that it's so myopic to think that one vaccine will deliver all the outcomes that are required of the vaccine program. I think that it was just so erroneous not to consider that there would be, a Pfizer option and a Moderna option, because we know that countries like the US, Japan, the UK had already secured Pfizer deals by July of 2020, which is a long way back. And we're in talks much before then, when Australia only managed to secure one single deal for Pfizer by the end of 2020. Like, if you talk, that's a whole 6 months there that could have been absolutely reduced. And has like most of the speakers have been saying, would have put us in a much more ideal situation at this point in time.
Yeah, and I guess, look, that I understand the sentiment behind that question, and I think what's important is perhaps the outcomes that we have in Australia, in that when there was a original COVID outbreak in Australia, all those, the most vulnerable in our society, those over 60, they were able to get AstraZeneca. And then when Delta came around and it was infecting and impacting younger people, and we're getting younger death rates, we were able to secure the vaccine supply from Poland. So I think that's a great testament to the federal government. And on a personal note, I would agree with you, Neve, but as a member of the Liberal government, I'm going to say we were able to mitigate the harm to Australians, and that's why we're in such a good position in comparison to the rest of the world.
Mohammed, do you have any questions?
No questions right now, thank you.
Okay. Can I ask the Prime Minister? So, Prime Minister, do you care about Australians, and do you empathize with their suffering? It's a yes and no.
I think it's important that all politicians care about Australians.
It's a yes and no question.
I sympathise for those under Liberal governance in Victoria who have spent some of the longest time in lockdown throughout the world, over 200 days. I really do feel for those Australians, and quite frankly, one of the Liberal tenets is freedom of speech and freedom of the individual, and that's what I think is why we should.
Okay. Can I ask another question as a follow-up? So you say the Liberal Party, you care about Australians, and you emphasize their suffering, but how can you empathize with their suffering when on Father's Day you took a private jet with taxpayer money to go see your family, whilst most Victorians and people in New South Wales could not exit their house or see their family? Isn't that a bit hypocritical? Using taxpayer money to do that, if anything.
Look, as Prime Minister, my role takes me all around Australians. It's very important for me to meet every part of Australia. And if it so happens that my family happens to be in a particular area of the city, then of course it's only natural, it's only human that we see our family if it's safe to do so. And within my role of traveling around Australia, it was safe to do so. And Minister Greg Hunt assured me under the best health advice it was safe to do so, and it was within COVID restrictions. So I do care, I do empathise for Australians, and that's why we put forward the national plan. That's why we've put forward the national cabinet, and that's why we're going to get Australians opened up and we're going to get them vaccinated with these new deals that we have coming from Poland. Thank you. I love just shitposting.
Does anyone else have any questions?
I guess, I have a question for the Labor Party, and also in the event that there was by chance a minority government with the Greens as well. When Atagi changed their advice against the AstraZeneca vaccine, would you have recommended still advancing the mandatory or strongly encourage AstraZeneca vaccine for all Australians, despite it being against the health advice? This is end of last year.
I'll go first, so be real quick.
Yeah, Freddie can go first. Go for it.
Well, the thing is, Mr. Prime Minister, when it came to that stage, it is called being stuck between a rock and a hard place. And the federal government, when it comes to the lives of tens of millions of Australians, shouldn't be stuck between a rock and a hard place. What the federal government should have done, like what Labor have suggested in early 2020, was to buy a variety of vaccines from Pfizer to AstraZeneca, to Moderna, to even the baby powder Johnson Johnson, for God's sakes. And if we have a variety of baskets, instead of putting all of our eggs into one basket, we wouldn't be in the predicament that the federal government under Scott Morrison, the bringer of disasters, have put us in time after time and time again.
Obviously, yes, that would be the ideal situation, which Freddie has just informed us of, having that vast vaccine portfolio before getting into that position. However, in the case where that wasn't done, i.e., in accordance with the Liberal government, a myopic and short-sighted avenue, I thought. But anyways, I would ensure that the clarity of communication would be better than it was. I think that because people were so confused as to whether a lot of people didn't even know that ATAGI was independent. So I think that was important I just think that, a clarity of communication of the current situation would have been better, rather than, oh no, we're going back on what we previously recommended. And that's a lot of what was I suppose reported by the media. I think that obviously, there are limitations to that. You can't control everything that the media says, but I think if there was clarity of communication from the get-go and transparency within the situation, I think a lot of hesitancy would have been avoided.
Fair enough. And
I would just like to talk about a point the member of Liberal brought up a few points ago. You mentioned that Victoria is one of the most locked down states. Well, yes, it is. Wouldn't you think it's more ideal to get across the message to Australians, specifically Victorians, that Victoria, despite its outbreak right now, has been one of the few places in the world that have had the lowest deaths and that have had the lowest cases. I don't think it's a good message to get out to, especially the hesitant and confused Australians out there that lockdowns are taking away my freedoms, they're taking away this, taking away that, but what else is it bringing you? Just as an example, I'd like to bring up Tennessee in America, which has approximately the same size, population, and population density as Victoria, and they have not been in lockdown other than the one federal lockdown they had early 2020, and the odds of dying from COVID, and this is dying, not just getting a case, this is dying from COVID, are 26 times more in Tennessee than it is in Victoria. So I think it's fair to say that lockdowns work. And yes, lockdowns, while not ideal, it is the only situation, it's the only thing we can do when we're in the middle of an outbreak. And the only thing we could do before an outbreak
Recording in progress.
Is make federal quarantine facilities away from the cities.
Recording stopped.
So that an outbreak doesn't occur.
That's there's a couple of points there. I think thank you for your question. It's a really interesting idea comparing Australian states to states overseas. I personally prefer comparing one Australian state to another Australian state because we're under very similar political system and similar values and beliefs. So when we talk about the US, they very strongly value individual freedoms and individual liberty, where they have a higher threshold for death compared to the loss of those freedoms. But what I would say, though, is when we do compare Victoria, particularly at the end of 2020, because of the high deaths in old people per capita or per infected person, Melbourne had quite a high death rate. And one of the reasons behind that, I do agree with you, is that the lockdown prevented that the COVID from spreading to the younger population, where those infected people would be less likely to die. But we still did have a higher death rate per case of COVID in Melbourne at the end of 2020. But what's important now is that while lockdowns have worked in the past, National Cabinet, which has been brought on by the federal government, is that we can't keep going into lockdowns in the future. It's not going to be economically viable. It's not going to be socially viable. And we're going to have a rampant mental health crisis. I think wait times for crisis mental health clinics have gone from 2 weeks to 4 months to see a counsellor as a result of more people feeling COVID fatigue and feeling the mental burden of not being able to see their friends and family. So I think while we can look at the benefits of lockdown, and they have previously been effective, now that we have another strategy, we also need to look at the economic cost and also the comparative advantage of not going into lockdowns. And so if we compare it to other states in Australia, yes, New South Wales did at one point, throwing over to Freddie's point, have a higher caseload. But at this point in time, Melbourne, despite being in lockdown, has higher case numbers than Sydney ever had, even with their reluctant stance to go into lockdown. So it is sort of tempting to play politics and just shit all over the Labor Party. But I think now as a collective country, we need to move away from the mindset of snapping lockdowns and into living with COVID and an endemic disease.
I have a point of information for the Prime Minister. You
Go for it.
mentioned all the disasters in New South Wales and in Victoria. Can I just ask, how was Australia 5 months ago behind Bangladesh, a third world country, Lebanon, an entire country without power right now due to a corrupt government, and why are we right now number 56 in the world behind every developed country in terms of vaccine rollout? Doesn't this speak of the neoliberal gutting of the health system that you promote and the incompetence of your leadership as a whole? And how can you say that we should stay unified when you attack Dan Andrews non-stop as the federal government? And doesn't that make you hypocritical on this matter?
Wow, there's so many questions in that. I guess just to pick it apart, look, if you're going to, I find it interesting that you constantly refer to some countries as if they are inferior to us. But I think what we need to look at when we talk about these countries, why they have a higher vaccination rate, is because they've also had higher death rates. It's out of necessity that they've allocated more resources and they've spent a lot more per dose of vaccine to get these vaccines into arms in their country. Australia, as I've mentioned before, is a victim of its own success because, as Melissa was mentioning before, of our effective lockdowns towards the end of 2020, where the risk of 1 in 100,000 of a negative outcome from an AstraZeneca vaccine was greater than the risk of a 0% negative outcome from COVID because we did not have any COVID. That's why our vaccine rate was so low, because people were reluctant. If you look at the vaccine hesitancy, prior to outbreaks in Australia, it was incredibly high. Roughly 1 in 3 Australians were considering waiting, delaying, or not even getting the vaccine around in the 2020s. Now that we have outbreaks in Australia, vaccine hesitancy has dropped. I think it dropped 8% in the last 2 months, which is really extraordinary. So really, you need to look at the cost and also the motivations behind why people are getting vaccinated and why states are dedicating more resources and more funding towards vaccines. And in Bangladesh, and I forget the other country you mentioned, but it's because they have higher death rates. And I just have a question for the Greens. The Greens long throughout this crisis have been critical of the federal government, and yet they have failed to push forward a national plan, and they have been reluctant to embrace national cabinet. I asked the Greens, what would they truly have done differently, knowing at the time what we knew then? What would they have done so differently that would have made them a more prosperous or made Australians better off?
I'm quite excited to answer this, but Mudasi, do you have a point of information before we go ahead?
Just
Feel
a little
free
bit.
to go. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So you mentioned, yes, lockdown's economically hard, and it is economically hard on the states to keep locking down over and over again. However, it's important to note that you said it's not great to compare it to other countries, but I think it is good to compare it to other countries, especially because it's a pandemic, not an epidemic. And it is affecting every single other country of all sorts of, different budgets, all sorts of different risks that they can take. According to the scientific journal, The Lancet, they did outweigh the economical, health, and I think there was human freedom indexes of the impacts of lockdown. And they concluded that locking down is effective in both saving more lives, saving more money and saving, people's general view of freedom around surrounding freedom. This is mainly by comparing other countries, and while Australia does lie in that point of, one of the more lockdown cities in countries in the world, I think while yes, lockdowns have cost Australians a lot and it has cost the Australian government a lot, I think during an outbreak, lockdown is the right thing to do, while prior to an outbreak, the vaccination would have been the right thing to do to prevent it. So as you brought up the vaccine hesitancy of, lots of people not getting AstraZeneca, lots of people reconsidering it because we had zero COVID and we didn't care about it. If we did have that choice and we did see Delta start spreading in India, I'm pretty sure out of that 1/3, it would have been more like 2/3 at least of people being like, all right, you know what? Maybe let's not risk it. And maybe let's go get the Pfizer or the Moderna if it was available at that point. Thank you.
Okay, no, that's a lot of good points. I really love analyzing the economic impact of lockdowns and comparing it to different countries. I respectfully would disagree with perhaps the economic impact of lockdowns specifically within the Australian context. So not necessarily amongst other countries, but Australia prior to COVID, we'd value the additional year of life gained at about $200,000. So if someone had cancer and we could buy medication that would treat them, if the medication cost more than $200,000, the Australian government would say it's not economically viable to buy those medications because those funds could be spent elsewhere to benefit the population. So it could be spent on other goods and services that could increase the quality or the length of the lifespan. What we're finding now is that lockdowns have a greater than $200,000 per person cost per year. And what we're finding is that against those original metrics and those values, that the cost of lockdown is becoming so immense that we need to start looking at is the quality of someone's life by delaying cancer treatment, by delaying optional surgeries. In lockdown, you're not able to go into hospital to get elective surgeries, the cost to the quality of life, you need to ask, is it worth extending someone's life but reducing the quality of their life as well? And these are very difficult conversations, and it's difficult to find out where the right spot is. But I just want to jump back to pre-COVID. We valued every additional year of life gained at $200,000, and currently we're blowing that out of the water. So I don't know, it's a difficult one. And as a Labor Liberal, I haven't really thought a response to it. Yeah, but that's about all I got. And yeah, so.
Neve, would you like to finish us off?
Yeah, I'll just speak in response to what Nick asked me before. Of course, it is well known that one of the weaknesses of our Greens Party is that we don't often have our full schemes and plans in place. However, I will ensure that you are aware that through our extensive lobbying throughout 2020 and 2021, we were able to secure additional income for JobKeeper, for the job seeker programs, and we made sure that the federal government, although had some interesting times, were mainly accountable for their actions, and that the people could rely on us to tell the truth, even when Liberal parties were paying a lot of money to other corporations in order to hide a few secrets there. So I think that I will stand by the fact that although we may not have the most detailed of schemes, we are passionate about ensuring that people are well looked after during lockdown in terms of transparency and in terms of the right to know everything that is happening.
And I guess that just proves that all parties can work together to be part of the Liberal Party success story for COVID-19.
I'm good.
Here we go.
Oh.
Guys, that was a really fun debate. Muhammad, as the newcomer to the club, do you have any thoughts about how this debate went?
I think it was pretty good. I don't have many other debates to compare it to, but I reckon overall it was good. Yeah.
Oh yeah, Muhammad. Yeah, because if you really like this and you want more debates, make sure to join our debating club. where if we get enough people, maybe I'll do something like this every month and just, we have nothing to do anyway, so might as well. But anyways, guys, in terms of the prize money, since this was done mostly with club executive members, it will be a conflict of interest to award anyone with a prize money. So I hope you do understand, Mohammed. So we don't have enough people to actually award the prize money and not go against Monsu rules. But in the next debate, if we get more people, I'm happy to award the prize money. And when it comes to the winner, I guess I myself have won. No, I'm kidding. I say everyone has done a terrific job. Everyone has been extremely passionate in what you do. And Nick, you were very good. You were on the defense, so you did a good job. Neem,
Only we had the impartial party, because deciding a winner with
yeah,
everyone
no,
having
no, no,
stake in
no,
the debate
no,
is
no,
very
good.
difficult.
And Neem, you were very excellent as usual. And Mohammed, you were the first time I heard you speak, and I think you are a very talented debater, and you should really pursue debating. But I think you do really well. And other than that, is there any more questions? I mean, are there any more questions? No? Okay, all right. Thank you guys for attending the MCDC Mock Parliament Debate 2021. And I'll see you all in the next one. Catch you later. Bye bye.
Okay, guys.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Freddie.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye, guys.